During the Cold War, Western Europe prepared for an invasion by the Soviet Union, training and arming a clandestine army to fight back against the occupiers. The invasion never came, but the stay-behind army was still there, ready and willing to seek out new disturbing missions. This was the only bank in Milan that stayed open after 4 p.m. That day at 4:30, I just signed a contract between two old farmers. A colleague called me and said, "Come upstairs. I need you to give me some papers." When I arrived, I realized I'd forgotten a receipt. I opened the window and tried to call these two people, but they couldn't hear me. So I closed the window and did quite an unusual thing. I leant against the glass.
Mi appoggio con le spalle al vetro.
At 4:37 p.m. on December the 12th, 1969, a bomb exploded at the headquarters of the National Agrarian Bank in Milan's Piazza Fontana.
Una scena apocalittica.
It was an apocalyptic scene. Dead, injured, safe deposit boxes sprung open. I started to cry, "It's a bomb, it's a bomb," until someone from the police put their hand over my mouth and took me outside. 17 people were killed and 80 seriously injured. My little son Ignaz came home from his first day at school and he asked me, "Dad, can we go to the Oktoberfest?" So I said, "Let's go." They went on the ghost train. My daughter, who was older than him, cried when she came out. So my son called her a scaredy cat. Later I bought them a balloon and started to head home. Then, when we were close to the exit, the bomb, which exploded at the Munich Oktoberfest on September the 26th, 1980, killed 13 people and injured over 200. When I regained consciousness, I started to look for my children. First, I found my little boy. I asked him, "Are you okay?" He answered, "It's nothing, Dad, I just feel cold." So I turned around and went a little further to where my daughter was lying. Her whole body was torn open. She said to me, and I will never forget these words, "Dad, help me, will you?" Then she died. My son had 2 bomb fragments right through his head, so both of my children died. I just can't help wondering why. The dinner was ready, and we were waiting for my daughter, my son-in-law and their 2 children. Saturday was our family day. All of a sudden, I heard shooting from the Deleuze supermarket. We ran out to the terrace, and my wife screamed, "My children." I said, "Calm down. I will have a look at what happened." The doors to the supermarket were wide open and a crowd was pushing out. I wanted to go in against the tide, but people were saying, "Don't. People have been shot in there." Then they told me that my whole family had been shot. On November the 9th, 1985, a gang of armed men opened fire inside the Deleuze supermarket in Aalst, Belgium. Men, women and children were gunned down.
And there were 8 killed and 8 injured. Nobody understood. It was not classical gangsterism. You don't shoot on a child as a gangster. You do it if you're ordered to do it, like machines.
The massacre was just one out of a staggering 16 similar attacks carried out between 1982 and 85, which came to be known as the Brabant Massacres. In all, 28 people died and 20 were injured. To this day, the killers have never been identified. René de Witt believes that it must be in someone's best interests that they are never found.
If you discover the killers, you probably also discover other things.
Over a period of about 15 years, Europe was rocked by a series of terror attacks. The lives of thousands of people were turned upside down. But to this day, the outrages remain a mystery. The bomb left in Milan's Piazza Fontana was one of the worst attacks. But 40 years on, no one has been convicted of the crime. Public prosecutor Guido Salvini has tried repeatedly to convict the men he believes are responsible for the bombing. When we reopened the investigation in 1990, no one had been found guilty. The only guilty verdicts were for General Maletti and Captain Labruna, who had tried to derail the investigation. 2 leading agents in the Italian Secret Service were sentenced to prison in 1979 for hiding and protecting key suspects. The Secret Services had definitely obstructed the work of the judicial authorities by hiding evidence and burying reports. And when certain people had wanted to speak, it was decided that the best thing to do was plug the source, gag them and say we don't want to hear what they had to say. Investigators in other countries also found their inquiries sabotaged. The Munich blast was caused by a sophisticated pipe bomb, but just weeks after the attack, police concluded that a lone extremist, Gundolf Köhler, was responsible. He was found among the dead. Although numerous witnesses claimed they had seen Köhler in the company of 2 people just before the explosion, and despite the fact that Köhler was a member of a far-right paramilitary group, the police found no further suspects and closed the investigation. Ignaz Platzer and his lawyer Werner Dietrich believe they could be dealing with a cover-up. They want to see the inquiry reopened. Many of the witnesses who were interviewed by the Criminal Investigation Department said we were made to feel as if we were the criminals. We were interviewed so harshly that we had the impression that the investigators had their own theory, and that our evidence which challenged this was not welcome and was therefore painted as irrelevant or unreliable. There was something fishy about this story. The police just stopped investigating. I want justice. I want the real killers. For many years, the European attacks were viewed as unconnected events, the work of local terrorists. But now there are signs of a more sinister explanation. A car bomb in Italy, not long after the Piazza Fontana outrage, helped shed light on the other terror attacks in Europe. In 1972, near Petiano, in the northeast of Italy, a blast killed 3 policemen. Eventually, investigators trained their sights on Vincenzo Vinciguerra and his right-wing terrorist group Ordine Nuovo. Public prosecutor Felice Casson spent 10 years investigating the attack.
Sono stati accusati prima l'estrema sinistra.
First of all, the extreme left was accused. And then, because this line of inquiry didn't hold up, the state then accused small local gangsters. At a certain point, it became clear that the Carabinieri, the secret services, the police, and even the magistracy in Investigators discovered that members of the Carabinieri and the Gorizia Magistrate's Office had doctored and suppressed crucial evidence in a bid to implicate left-wing extremists.
Quindi complessivamente
It was actually the entire apparatus of state that covered up the movements of these neo-fascists who carried out this massacre.
che avevano fatto la strage.
Vincenzo Vinciguerra is now serving a life sentence for the Peteano attack. But testifying in court in the mid-1980s, he claimed that he and his right-wing group were protected and supported by a wider, shadowy organization that was connected at the highest levels to the military secret services. At the time, Vinciguerra's claims were dismissed, but Casson, who had first brought him to trial, kept on digging. In 1990, he gained access to the archives of the Italian Military Intelligence Service and unexpectedly unearthed documents revealing a top-secret organization. What came out was the existence of a secret clandestine structure headed by the chief of Italian Secret Services and codenamed Gladio, Stay Behind.
Gladio, Stay Behind.
Casson uncovered documents that connected this mysterious force to NATO. Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti was forced to go public, causing a major European scandal. He admitted that the secret organization, Gladio, existed, and he revealed that it was part of a much wider network of secret stay-behind armies coordinated by NATO throughout the whole of Europe during the Cold War. It turned out that Britain and the US had secretly trained and recruited civilians and military men in many European countries. Their role, according to the official version given by Andreotti, was to form a resistance movement in the event of a Soviet invasion.
Stay Behind in Europe was set up by NATO. It was intended to create an organization that in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, that there would be some kind of a structure that could conduct clandestine operations and maintain contact with the Western powers.
We were in a very different time. We were still in the Cold War. There was still the confrontation between the worlds of the West and the East. Europe was truly divided in two.
People were thinking about a possible confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact all the time. Cold War in that sense is a time period which there was no peace.
This was a war. It was a Cold War. And people died in the Cold War in a variety of ways.
The Yalta Agreement of 1945 had divided the world into two blocks. The Allies and the Soviets would stop at nothing to maintain their influence in their respective spheres. In the first years after Yalta and the close of World War II, US spheres were dominated by the brutal Soviet takeover of the Eastern European countries, as well as East Germany.
Russia's gigantic military machine stood almost intact, by far the biggest still left in the world.
The Allies' foremost concern was that the Soviets would now march into the rest of Germany and even cross the Rhine. Historian Daniel Ganser is the first to have examined the stay-behind networks across Europe.
NATO planners knew that the Soviet Union had a lot of manpower on European soil, so the Soviet Union could move very quickly to the Atlantic. And if you have such a situation, you must gain access to the territory again, and that was difficult. So they said, why don't we do it before? Okay, we set up arms caches, we put guns and munition and gold and whatever you need into these arms caches, and we have people already trained who know each other. And these people then can become active in case of a Soviet invasion as a guerrilla.
In very straightforward terms, an organization, once it had been created, would nominate trusted individuals who would be recruited to participate in Stay Behind. They would then undergo training, and some of them would come to England. They would go to Fort Monkton, which is the SIS training facility just outside Gosport. And there they would be taught tradecraft, clandestine communications, exfiltration, infiltration techniques. And then once they had completed the course, they would return to their normal activities. Most likely they would be reservists.
The concept of stay behind was born out of the Second World War experience of the Special Operations Executive, a branch of the British Secret Service, MI6.
Special Operations Executive, its main role was sabotage in Europe. Working with networks in France, Belgium, they were there to disrupt German lines of supply, blow up trains, etc. Shortly after war ends, these same networks are then turned around against the Russians. The Americans came in the late 1940s with lots of money. They had the resources, they had the equipment, they could outdo MI6 in all areas.
We're going to send the men who can train them to fight that kind of war.
And we have these men, experts in this kind of guerrilla warfare?
You bet we have.
Parliamentary investigations in Belgium and Italy later discovered that the stay-behind networks were managed by the local secret services in close cooperation with the CIA and MI6 in over 15 European countries, including neutral Switzerland and Austria. In each country, the network had its own name: Gladio in Italy, SDR-A8 in Belgium. In Germany, they were called Überall-Agenten. Gladio foot soldiers were recruited from a variety of sources.
It's not possible to stereotype the people that are involved in Gladio because they vary from country to country. The type of people also varies, depends on the terrain, maybe gamekeepers who are working in the mountains or the forests, skiers. Other places is clearly more urban-based.
And most of them were convinced that communism was a threat. So these are people on the right, sometimes on the extreme right. But we also had people, conservatives, Catholics, who just wanted to defend their country.
Men like Franco Bortolomeoli, a technician and keen parachutist from Bolzano in the far north of Italy.
Nei primi anni 60, quando avevo circa 19 anni,
in the early 60s, aged 19, in the spirit of adventure, I joined up for a parachuting course. The president of the association one day approached me and said, "If our country was invaded by a foreign power, would you be prepared to do something?" And I immediately responded, "Yes." "Fine, you're accepted." I asked, "Accepted by who?" The less you know, the better.
Meglio è. La nostra funzione non era quella di fermare l'Armata Rossa.
Our function wasn't to stop the Red Army. We wouldn't have been capable of stopping anyone, but to assist the people who came to our aid to enter the occupied territory.
Quando facevamo le esercitazioni ci veniva segnalato.
When we trained, we were told that on a specific day, at a specific hour, a plane would arrive and it would have dropped 1 or 2 teams of soldiers, English or Americans, special forces, who would have to take action.
Inglesi o americani.
It was hypothesized that perhaps they would have to overrun a barracks belonging to the invaders.
Ipotizzavano che dovevano andare ad assaltare una caserma degli invasori.
As in Italy, the Belgian stay-behind network was covertly trained during regular military exercises. Jean-Claude Marler was the commander of the Wiesalm barracks. Throughout the 1980s, they were the venue for the Belgian Army's annual training maneuvers called Ösling.
Cette manœuvre regroupait des éléments belges, quelques éléments luxembourgeois.
The Ösling maneuvers took place in the presence of elements from Belgium, from Luxembourg, and American special forces stationed in Germany. So there were conventional elements, but equally secret, hidden elements, elements with extremely confidential motivations and techniques. This was a maneuver that was almost secret.
Une manœuvre pratiquement secrète, dans le cadre des activités OTAN.
These were regular NATO maneuvers. However, what was happening inside them was a completely different thing altogether.
Autre chose.
Lucien Disler was a member of the Belgian stay-behind and was responsible for logistics during the maneuvers. I was a patriot and a convinced anti-communist. I march with anyone. It does not matter to me if it was the Minister of Defense who was asking, or a colonel, or the NATO, or the Americans. It's none of my business.
Simplement les Américains, ce n'est pas mon problème.
On the night of the 12th of May 1984, the Rats barracks at Wiesalm in the east of Belgium came under attack from a group of highly trained men. a sentry was gunned down in a volley of machine gun fire, and hundreds of weapons were stolen. The attack on the armory of Vilsam was a training exercise. These are exercises pushed to the extreme in order to create the most realistic situation possible, to test the resistance and the capacity of the soldiers. They are extreme exercises, but exercises nonetheless.
L'officier de garde est arrivé ici. Il a été voir.
It was exactly here where the officer watched from the block. Then he came here. The other came out from there and fired a machine gun. The officer fell to the ground.
L'officier est tombé. Il a été gravement blessé.
Depuis ce jour, j'ai toujours su que l'attaque de la caserne était une bavure de manœuvre.
From that day, I always thought that the attack was a deviation from the maneuver, an accident. But then, years later, I found myself face to face with the guard who had been shot. He said, "No, it wasn't like that. They shot me to stop me. I fell down and pretended to be dead. Then the shooter approached again and tried to kill me with machine gun fire. At that point, I realized that it wasn't an accident, but a murder attempt." Miraculously, the guard survived. Following the Vilsam attack, the Belgian and US military denied any involvement. Authorities suspected Lucien Disler of taking part in the attack, which he denies.
Je peux pas dire que je sais qui a tiré.
I can't say that I know who has shot. If I really knew, I'm not sure that I would talk. I'm 70, but I still have the desire to live some years more. It's simple. I don't want to find myself dead, hanging from a tree like a friend of mine in the south of France. I know the techniques these people use. Jean-Claude Marlet believes the Vilsam raid and the Brabant supermarket attacks could be connected.
Bien avant moi, il y a de hauts magistrats, des policiers sérieux, des chercheurs qui ont...
There are high magistrates, serious policemen and investigators who have recognized similarities between the Vilsam raid and the Brabant killings long before I did. I have analyzed the way they tried to kill the sentry at Vilsam and the way some of the Brabant victims were killed. These are extremely lucid, perfectly organized, cold-blooded killers with an entirely military modus operandi.
Froid. Tout est parfaitement militaire.
The recruitment of all kinds of people to their paramilitary groups was a tradition established by the Allies in the immediate years after World War II. They had taken seriously the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and had enlisted prominent Nazis to the anti-Soviet cause. One of them, the SS spy master Reinhard Gehlen, would become the founder of the first post-war German Secret Service, which would later oversee the country's stay-behind network. In the early years of the Cold War, no one did more than Gehlen to feed US fears of a growing Soviet menace. President Truman poured millions into a variety of covert operations and intelligence programs against the communist threat. The US National Security Act of 1947 provided the legal foundation for US covert action and what was termed unorthodox warfare. The strategy was carefully outlined in National Security Council Directive 10/2 and would greatly influence the way the secret services went on to operate.
NSC 10/2 says that all means must be used, including setting up secret armies, including manipulating the population with fear or propaganda, and that a lot of money must be poured into this.
The communist coup in Czechoslovakia, the Berlin blockade and the outbreak of war in Korea did much to nurture US fears of a Soviet invasion in Europe. Suspicions spiraled on either side of the Iron Curtain. Behind the official face of NATO, the drive to organize and establish the secret stay-behind networks in Western Europe intensified.
What did the stay-behind networks do while they were waiting for the Russian invasion? Well, they trained and they got engaged in local politics. And that is where you see the most important and the most damaging impact of these stay-behind organizations in Western European countries.
In the years after the war, the communist parties in Western Europe saw huge gains in popularity. Their relationship with their Soviet comrades was of great concern. At that time, Peter Sickel was the head of the CIA office in Berlin.
You had a very strong Italian Communist Party, French Communist Party, so there was a sense of insecurity because we also knew that the Russians availed themselves of those communist parties for political action.
As the risk of a communist political victory increased, so the strategy of the stay-behind armies turned away from the threat of invasion towards the enemy within.
The most important document for a historian right now is dated June 1, 1959, and it's actually a document from the Italian Military Secret Service, and it says that Gladio was set up on the one hand to become active in case of a Soviet invasion, and on the other hand in case of sovvertimenti interni, which means domestic unrest. I mean, we know from the 50s on that the secret armies had the twofold task.
Some of the earliest evidence for the role of NATO's secret armies in political subversion comes from a German scandal from the 1950s.
In 1952, we had a member of the German stay-behind network walking into the police station in Frankfurt and saying, "I am a member of a secret army. We are being trained by an American in how to kill people, how to leave no traces, how to hide in forest. We have arms, we have explosives, and we are actually secret."
Adenauer was incensed that things like that were being done by the Americans without his knowledge. And it was not that I objected to it being done, but I would have been somewhat more careful in my choice of people.
The man who walked into the police station in 1952 was Hans Otto, a former SS officer who had grown alarmed by the direction his stay-behind unit was taking. His testimony led to the discovery of a secret training center deep in the Hessen woods of central Germany. But what came as the biggest shock to investigators was that the paramilitaries seemed to have been handed a more sinister political mission.
They had lists of people whom they wanted to kill, respected members of the community. And we always wonder, assassinated in case of a Soviet invasion or assassinated in case of a domestic change of power. And at that point, everybody thought there would be a very thorough investigation of the German stay-behind.
But no such investigation followed. After some deft diplomacy between the US and Germany, the 100 alleged conspirators, all right-wing extremists, were released. The case was quickly closed and forgotten until a new scandal hit the headlines 30 years later. Just one day after the Oktoberfest attack, police discovered that the alleged bomber, Gundolf Köhler, who had died in the blast, was a member of the neo-Nazi paramilitary organization Wehrsportsgruppe Hoffmann.
Gundolf Köhler hat sich für Sprengstoff und Waffen interessiert, ist damit auch bei der Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann in Erscheinung getreten. Die Polizei hat sofort...
Gundolf Köhler had been interested in weapons and explosives. He had appeared like that also within the Wehrsportsgruppe Hoffmann. After the attack, the police immediately searched his parents' house in Donaueschingen and found what they described as a bomb laboratory, but they only found chemicals suitable for homemade explosives. Yet it was discovered that heavily charged military explosives had been used in the Munich attack. One has to ask oneself how he got hold of this kind of explosive.
Diesen Sprengstoff beschafft haben kann.
In the days following the massacre, police interrogated some of his comrades.
These people, during interrogation, said, "We had our weapons and the explosives from another right-wing extremist, and his name is Heinz Lemke." And the funny thing is, this was never investigated.
Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren.
The weapon caches found close to Lüneburg seem much bigger than they first appeared. A year after the Munich Oktoberfest bomb in 1981, deep in the Lüneburg woods of northern Germany, hikers happened upon a huge arms cache that belonged to forest ranger Heinz Lemke. Lemke was a right-wing activist with extensive contact to the German neo-Nazi scene. The Eastern German Secret Service, the Stasi, had pinpointed the exact location of transmitters used by the West German stay-behind groups. One of them was traced to Lüneburg, very close to Lemke's home, and the spots where his arms caches were found. Weapons caches such as these were in the remit of a European strategy. That much is established. But if you were then to investigate how much Lemke had to do with all this, to what extent he had weapons and explosives at his disposal, and to what extent these were similar or identical to the explosives used in the Oktoberfest attack, such an investigation would yield results. After his arrest, Lemke told investigators about the existence of a further 30 arms caches. He said that he was prepared to reveal his backers, but before he could deliver his testimony, he was found dead, hanging from the ceiling of his prison cell. His death provides a chilling link to the Brabant killings in Belgium. Evidence there also points to a link to a paramilitary organization. Police Commissioner Eddie Vos has been investigating the Brabant killings for many years. We found out that there is a specific modus operandi and that each person in the gang has his role. There is one guy that starts shooting right away if someone is in his way, and the way he fires and the way he positions himself makes me think of someone who has been trained in how to handle a gun. The Belgian parliamentary report from 1990 concluded that the killers must have been members or former members of the security forces, right-wing extremists who enjoyed a high level of protection.
Pour être un tueur du Brabant.
The Brabant killers were from a certain elite, but that's not all. They were guaranteed impunity.
Leur garantir l'impunité.
When a commission of inquiry tried to establish concrete links to the Belgian stay-behind army, SDR A8, the head of the military secret service, refused to disclose the names of the stay-behind soldiers. There was evidence of a link to a neo-Nazi network called Westland New Post, WNP for short. Their leader, Paul Latinus, confirmed that he had been asked to assemble a group of anti-communist paramilitaries. He refused to say who had ordered the mission. He later claimed that he had been in the pay of US Secret Services. Effectively, there were many similarities between the stay-behind network and the network created by WNP. There were a number of soldiers and ex-soldiers in the WNP who believed they were working for the state, or considered themselves agents of the state. Shortly after the last of the Brabant massacres, Latinus was arrested. But before he could talk, like Lemke in Germany, he too was found dead in his prison cell, with a telephone cord around his neck. But why should secret right-wing armies terrorize peaceful countries like Belgium, Germany, and Italy in the heart of Western Europe? The answer lies in a shift in Cold War thinking. The end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 had brought a kind of stability. A conventional Soviet invasion of Western Europe no longer seemed likely in the face of a stalemate in which the East and the West held themselves in check with nuclear missiles. Now the US was determined to build up and expand its bases in Europe, and Italy was a key site. But Italian politics were unstable. The left was still gaining ground and had the potential to upset Washington's plans. Richard Gardner worked in Italy on behalf of various US administrations for over 20 years.
Italy was a key element in the southern flank of NATO. And the Communist Party of Italy opposed every practical measure to strengthen NATO. So there was concrete evidence that Italy could not be a good NATO ally if the communists took control.
In the light of the evolving situation, the purpose of the stay-behind armies was revised.
The CIA was beginning to realize that these stay-behind operations were of no significance, except that they served as a network to keep strong anti-communist people together and to keep them motivated. It was almost like a club, a fraternal organization.
In a luxury hotel in Rome in 1965, the crème de la crème of the Italian right and the secret services met. This meeting of what was known as the Istituto Pollio would radically alter Italian society. There weren't just far-right extremists, but also political scientists, researchers of the Revolutionary War, officials of the chiefs of staff. So there was a large section of thought which believed that you needed to take preventative action against communism with all means available.
Con ogni mezzo. All'Istituto Pollio, il SID, lo Stato Maggiore dell'Esercito e il Servizio.
At Instituto Pollio, the head of the army and the military secret services said what very clearly they wanted to do. They spoke of the fourth dimension of war. After the first phase of the ground war, the second phase of the Navy, the third phase of the Air Force, the fourth phase is the phase that deals with the conquest of the hearts and minds of the population. This is the war that was fought and still is fought today, also by the means of low-intensity conflicts, even by means of what we define terrorism. Many different groups were called upon to take an active role in this fourth phase and fight against communism. Among them was the Italian stay-behind network, Gladio, parts of which now became directly involved in political subversion. Of course, the individual militant or the soldier from Gladio didn't know the precise figure above them in the hierarchy. But we know that the bosses of Gladio were in contact with those of the secret services and the various movements, and this makes us think that perhaps there was this higher direction. After the Pollio meeting in Rome, Italy was hit by a series of bombings. Initially, there was only material damage. But with the Piazza Fontana massacre in 1969, one of the darkest periods in Italian history began. Some historians now think it formed part of a semi-official secret project known as the Strategy of Tension.
La strategia della tensione è stato un fenomeno complesso, in cui i vari attori...
The strategy of tension was a complex phenomenon in which the various figures which had operated didn't have the same objectives. There were groups of the extreme right who really wanted to destroy the democratic system with a coup. At their side for sure were commanders of the military, parts of the secret services, conservative forces in general, who were using this first group. Rather than a full-blown coup, they wanted a kind of stabilization of the institutions of power.
Più che a un vero e proprio golpe, a una stabilizzazione delle istituzioni.
Destabilize the public order to stabilize the political order and justify a repressive intervention, which would be welcomed with relief by the population. People want to live in peace. They don't want to walk into a bank or get on a train and die because of a bomb put there by some unknown killer. In Belgium, Police Commissioner Eddie Vos is coming to a similar conclusion about the central role of the fear created by the attacks.
Here
in Belgium, we had soldiers in nearly all the parking lots of the big supermarkets. We had to do our shopping with 2 snipers on the roof. We were extremely frightened. And that actually fits into this strategy, which was an important element of terrorism.
La Belgique avait peur.
Belgium was scared. Once fear has been installed in a population, you can make them do anything. The killings in 1980s Belgium took place at a time of political unrest. Tens of thousands of demonstrators had taken to the streets to protest against US plans to station new nuclear rockets on Belgian soil. It was a very troubled period in Belgium. We had hundreds of thousands of people on the street demonstrating against the installation of missiles, and not everybody was happy with that. People realized that Belgium was a bit the slack belly of the NATO, and we had to prove the American big brother that we were serious. The Brabant killings finished because the mission was accomplished. The emotional shock was sufficient to allow the Belgian state to leave a state of lethargy and reinforce itself. That's it. In Germany as well, the Oktoberfest bomb exploded at a crucial moment. The governing Social Democrat Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, was perceived by some as too weak to handle the left-wing terrorism of the Red Army faction and the growing anti-nuclear movements. According to press reports, elements in the Secret Service were determined to bring hardliner Franz Josef Strauss to power. Investigators suspect that elements within stay-behind and far-right organizations used the strategy of tension to break the left and encourage a population cowed by terrorism to keep reliable centrist governments in power in Western Europe, but not in Britain.
The Security Service in the United Kingdom is an independent organization and cannot participate in partisan politics. There are plenty of people who've worked in the Security Service on the left, and I would imagine that any participation on the right has been purely in terms of penetrating political organizations. The Security Service had no brief, and as far as I know, never sabotaged political organizations.
The interference of foreign secret services in European politics may be hard to prove, but there is evidence from the Piazza Fontana inquiry.
La scoperta forse più interessante che abbiamo
Perhaps the most interesting discovery we made during the investigation was the relationship between the cells of Ordine Nuovo, the extreme right-wing group from Veneto, and the American bases always situated in that region.
Situate sempre in quella regione.
I visited our station in Rome in September, October '69, and the chief of station told me that he was having some problems with naval intelligence, which wanted to run some operations in Italy, some clandestine operations, and he seemed annoyed. And he said, I told him, I don't care if they run any operations, just as long as they don't interfere with any of CIA's work.
While investigating the Piazza Fontana bombing, prosecutor Guido Salvini established the involvement of Carlo Di Giglio, a terrorist with the far-right paramilitary organization Ordine Nuovo, and an informant for US naval intelligence.
Di Giglio è un militante di Ordine Nuovo.
Carlo Di Giglio was a militant for Ordine Nuovo. He dealt with the logistic sides of things. He was a weapons expert and a central figure. This man regularly visited US bases such as the one in Verona. He was inserted by the US into their informers network, kept them informed about what he was doing, and he also received instructions from them. So he was a kind of double agent. He told us all this in details.
Con un grandissimo numero di dettagli.
Quando si parla di Carlo Di Giglio.
When you speak of Carlo Di Giglio and the work he carried out at Piazza Fontana, you need to describe him in the correct terms, not as a fascist, but as an agent of the secret services, son of an agent of the secret services. It was these secret services who sent him to carry out this work for them inside the far right. Di Giglio reconstructed piece by piece for us all the phases that led up to Piazza Fontana. He told us about a cottage where he prepared the bombs, and he told us bits about Piazza Fontana, but not everything. because as a technician he observed the preparation of the explosives, but he remained when the car with the bombs started its journey to Milan. Piazza Fontana was conceived to permit the President of the Republic and the serving government to declare a state of emergency. It was an institutional coup d'etat. In 1969, the mechanism seemed perfect. A culprit for the Piazza Fontana massacre was immediately identified in the left-wing anarchist Pietro Valpreda. Valpreda was arrested by us, identifying that we should not make names. But the public did not buy the theory and suspected a cover-up. For 3 days, the country ground to a standstill. But the Italian president did not declare the state of emergency which Vinciguerra and his comrades had hoped for. But this was not to be the end of the strategy of tension. Over the following decade, the Italian people were tormented by a series of terrorist outrages. Climax came with a bomb at Bologna station that killed 85 and left over 200 injured. These events have led terrorist Vinciguerra to believe that ultra-right groups such as his own were manipulated by the state. I challenge it when people say that the period of the massacres in Italy were carried out by fascists. I oppose it because all those attacks were carried out by men who were working for the state apparatus. They were all connected to that apparatus and were always protected and hidden by that apparatus. Despite more than 20 trials, almost all those accused of involvement in the terror attacks have escaped jail. Men like Gianni Maletti, a leading agent in the Italian secret services, who was convicted of protecting Ordine Nuovo terrorists, but who fled to South Africa before serving his sentence. Or Delfo Zorzi, who was believed to have planted the Piazza Fontana bomb, but who now lives in Japan. I was convinced for years that you can make mistakes in good faith. In the end, I've made mistakes myself belonging to this organization, but at a certain point you have to tell the truth. In Italy, many of the terror attacks are still unsolved. For the Piazza Fontana murders, we still haven't found anyone guilty from a judicial point of view, even if historically there is a truth in the thousands of documents collected by the Commission of Inquiry into the attacks. Likewise in Belgium, many are still awaiting the answers that have eluded the Brabant investigation for so long. A state that accepts that you go and gun down men, women and children in 3 attacks in 2 days simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time doing their shopping is a state which doesn't merit respect and which doesn't deserve to survive. How can a population be expected to have faith in the future if 16 people are gunned down in the space of a few minutes and nobody gives a damn about the results?
So there must be, until today, I think, people I don't know who don't want the truth to be known. I'm sure of that.
At least in Munich, there was some hope that the real investigators of the Oktoberfest massacre might one day be brought to justice.
Die besten Chancen, diesen Anschlag aufzuklären, gab es nach der Tat. Die Zeugen
The best chance to find out who was really behind this bomb came straight after the attack. The witnesses who said that Köhler was accompanied should have been far more thoroughly interviewed. Today there is the crime scene evidence which could be analyzed with the latest scientific methods. We've seen in recent years that a great many unsolved murders have been solved in this way.
Einer Asservatenkammer einer Lösung zugeführt werden konnten.
Lawyer Werner Dietrich and the victims Platzer and Martinez are still trying to reopen the inquiry into the Oktoberfest attack, but they have discovered that much of the original evidence is missing.
Leider musste uns die Generalbundesanwaltschaft mitteilen.
Unfortunately, the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office informed me that a lot of evidence they had been expecting to get hold of has been destroyed or thrown away. There are no traces left.
Keinerlei Spuren mehr dort. Es gibt insbesondere.
How could they destroy the actual evidence exhibits for the trial? In other cases, suspects are still being pursued. Here we are dealing with mass murderers, and they destroy the evidence.
Also mehr als ungewöhnlich, dass
It's highly unusual that in an inquiry that has neither expired nor been judicially completely closed, the bomb fragments and body fragments, etc., should have been destroyed.
und so weiter vernichtet werden,
The question is, what kind of interests lie behind this, and what is being covered up?
nicht aufgeklärt werden sollen.
I will continue fighting until the real killers are found. NATO's secret army is an incomplete story. In November 1990, the European Parliament condemned Gladio and Stay Behind, requesting full investigations, which have yet to be done, and total dismantlement of these paramilitary structures. But 20 years on, there is no real proof that these secret armies have been disbanded.
Those people who are so enthusiastic about covert operations should remember, first of all, they don't remain secret for very long. And they should ask themselves, if this operation becomes public, what will be the reaction, not only in America, but in the country concerned? What will it do to America's moral authority?
The legacy of stay-behinds is that the tactics that created the stay-behinds in the first place are still in place and continue to be used today. They are standard operating procedure. The people who pay the primary price for this are ordinary men and women globally.
Fear of an enemy like communism had created a secret weapon which seemed to spiral out of control. Maybe the wars against the new enemies of the 21st century will breed similar nightmares for future generations to investigate.